Chapter 10, A Long Walk to Water. At the end of chapter 9, there's some visitors to Naya's community. And we see in chapter 10 that the men finish their meeting. And as they finish, they stand up and they walk past Naya's house. And they walk past the children and the group of people that are standing there waiting to find out what they're doing there. And the children follow them. They go beyond her house and they go to a tree and they stand there and they're looking at the tree and they keep talking to Naya's uncle and they're discussing things with him. And then it says that there's another tree about 50 paces past the first one. So the men walk um, over to the next tree. Some of the men walk, and then some of the men stop halfway. So they're standing there, and the other men walk to the other tree and examine that tree. And the one calls out to the other guy in his language, and Naya doesn't know what he's saying until the translator tells the people of Naya's tribe what is said. And he says, "This is the spot halfway between the two largest trees. We will find the water here." So Naya's very confused by this because she's lived there all her life. And remember, she walks two times to the watering hole each morning to get water, and it's a long distance. And they do that because they don't have water right there where they are. So she's like, that's their area where they sing and they meet in a circle. And so there's no water there. Unless it's rained, there's no water there. But the idea is that these men, if there's a tree, there's got to be something that's giving that tree water so that it can grow. And so it makes sense that they would find the two largest trees in the community and then look for the spot between them for, okay, this is where water is going to be found. As we look where Salva is in chapter 10, we see they're still in the desert and he doesn't have much water left. At the start of chapter 10, he reaches for his gourd and he knew it to be half full, but it doesn't feel heavy enough to be half full. So that means he has less than half a gourd of water. And I'm imagining the gourd not to be very large, so not much water left. But there's these men, and remember the one woman went to help this man who was on the ground in the desert dying, and the people in their traveling group told her to leave him alone. There's not enough water, there's not enough things that she can do to help them, and she'll just end up dying herself if she gives her water. But Salva reaches for his gourd, and this shows his willingness to help someone in need because he's reaching for it. He sees that there's not much water in it. And Uncle sees him do this. And so he realizes what Salva's going to do and he stops him. And he realizes that Salva was going to share his water as well. And he tells him, "No, Salva, you are too small and not strong enough yet. Without water, you will not survive the rest of the walk. Some of the others, they will be able to manage better than you." So because he's young, he needs this water more than those men do. And the uncle convinces him of that. And here comes a couple other women. They're going to come and they share a little bit of their water with the men. And it says in page 58, like a miracle, the small amounts of water revived them. They were able to stagger to their feet and join the group as the walking continued. So these women saved these men's lives. Now the thing is that there's 5 other of those men that are already dead. They've already passed away. And it would take too much time and really too much effort for the people in the group to stop and bury these men. So they leave their bodies where they are. And Salva doesn't like thinking about that because he realizes that the vultures are going to come and consume the bodies of these men. And that's not really a respectful way for someone whose life has ended to be treated. But there's nothing he can do about it. But I think it is something that really just influences him and something that stays with him and motivates him in his future endeavors and what kind of man he becomes in the future. So he tries not to look, but of course he sees the dead bodies as they're walking by, and he thinks about them. It says on page 59, if he were older and stronger, would he have given water to those men? Or would he, like the most people in the group, have kept the water for himself? And I think, he really contemplates, like, would he have given his water to those men and been willing to sacrifice possibly his own life for them? And I think we see that it's a possibility that he would have, because of the way at the beginning of the chapter he reached for the gourd and was starting the movements towards sharing that water. And it doesn't seem like he thought about it. It seems like that was an instinct for him, something he did automatically. So I think that shows us that he would have shared with those men had he had the opportunity and the capability of doing so. Then it goes on to say on page 59, it was the group's third day in the desert. So it says by sunset, they would be out of the desert, and after that, it would not be far to the Itang refugee camp in Ethiopia. So they're getting so close to being out of the desert, but they're so weak. They haven't had food for a couple of days, and we'll talk about that a little bit further. But he starts to talk to Uncle about something. He's walking with Uncle, and he's been thinking about this all along, really. We've seen how he's worried about finding his family. And so he asks Uncle finally. He finally puts that worry into words. And he says, Uncle, if I am in Ethiopia, how will my parents ever find me? When will I be able to go back to Lun Arik? And he says, Uncle responds to him, I have talked to the others here. We believe that the village of Lun Arik was attacked and probably burned. And he can't even complete saying what he's saying because he doesn't want to tell Salva that there is the possibility that his family may have died in the attack. And so he pauses, and then he finally tells him that few people survived, and the ones who did survive would have fled into the bush as well. And there's really no way to know where they are. Like right now, there's no way to track them down, to trace where they went. So Salva says, okay, well, at least I'll have you in Ethiopia. And he has a little bit of comfort in that, well, at least he has Uncle. He has somebody from his family, somebody familiar to him, and someone who can relate to him and will help take care of him, and he can find comfort in that. But Uncle tells him no. He informs him that he needs to return and he needs to go back and join the army and fight for their country. So he says, I'm going to take you to the refugee camp, but then I will return to Sudan to fight in the war. And so Salva doesn't like this, and he stops and he grabs his uncle's arm and he says, but Uncle, I have no one who will be my family. And Uncle just tells him that, there's people, you'll make friends, and somebody will take care of you. You will be okay. But that's not really a great comfort to Salva because he wants his uncle. If he can't have his mother and father and his immediate family, he wants his uncle to be with him. But Uncle tells him that, not only will Salva need those other people who he'll befriend, but they'll need him too. And so that kind of gives him a duty to those people that he will be around in Ethiopia who will take him in. It says at the bottom of page 60, he knows it will be hard for me. Talking about Uncle. Salva says that his uncle knows it will be hard for Salva to adjust to Uncle leaving him in Ethiopia. But he says he does not want to leave me there. It's not his choice. But he has to go back and fight for a people. I mustn't act like a baby. I must try to be strong. So now you see a little bit of his maturity coming into play. He doesn't want Uncle to leave. He doesn't want him to leave him alone there. But he says, I have to grow up a little bit. I can't act like a baby. I have to be strong for Uncle, for myself, and for the people I will be around. So he tells Uncle, when you go back to Sudan, you might meet my parents somewhere. Could you tell them where I am? So he again begins to get this feeling of hope that maybe his family is still out there and he'll meet them again one day. And so his comfort in his uncle leaving is that his uncle will be back in Sudan and possibly will be able to find someone who knows something about his family, and he'll be able to be reconnected to his family through his uncle going back to Sudan. So that makes it okay for his uncle to leave him there. And it says at the kind of the top middle of page 61, Salva felt a tiny spark of hope. With Uncle looking for his family, there was a chance they might all be together again one day. Now, then we get to the part on page 61 where it says no one's eaten for 2 days and their water is pretty much almost gone. But they come across this area where they see some water, and as they see it, they see the trees and then they see the water. But the water's muddy, so it's not something they can drink. But near the water, there is a bird. And so they take the bird and they make a fire and they cook it. And even though there's not enough food for everybody in the group to eat a meal off of, it says at the bottom that he knows that he'll only get maybe a bite or two. But remember, they haven't eaten anything for it 2 days. So a bite or two of that bird is going to be probably enough. Because remember a couple chapters back when they ate so much they became sick? This is something they probably want to avoid at this time because then that causes more dehydration. So a bite or two is really all they need. And so that's a good thing. So while the bird's cooking, they hear these voices. And there's these armed men who come up. And these men tell them to sit down and put their hands on their heads. And so they comply. And the men come up to his uncle. And while they are approaching him, Salva notices that the one has ritual scarring on his face. And so he knows these men are of the Nuer tribe. Now remember, this is Naya's tribe, the Nuer tribe, and they fought with Salva's tribe. These men were not kind to Salva's tribe. These were the people they fought over land for in Sudan. And so the man asks Uncle if he's with the rebels, and Uncle tells him no. And he says, well, what are you doing? And he tells them that they're going to the refugee camp in Ethiopia. And so he answers their questions, but they tell him to get up and they tie him to a tree. And so that way he can't, fight them or whatever. And they begin to rob the people. They take the things that they have. They even take some of their clothing that they're wearing. And Salva becomes scared. He's scared of these men because they don't really know what they're going to do to them. And so it says on page 63, Salva was trembling. Even in the midst of his fear, he realized that for the first time on the trip, it was a good thing to be the youngest and the smallest. The men were not concerned about him. As a male, if he was bigger and older and stronger, he might have been seen as a threat by these men and they might have harmed him. But because he looks like a young boy still, and he's probably looks really weak as well from all the traveling and the lack of food and water, he's not a threat to these men, so they leave him alone. And then, too, they can't wear his clothes. So that's a huge plus. He's going to get to keep his clothes. So on page 63 in the middle of the words, it says, when the men finished their looting, they picked up Uncle's gun. Then they walked to the tree where Uncle was tied up. And Salva thinks maybe they will leave us alone now that they have robbed us. He heard them laugh as Salva watched. One of the men aimed his gun at Uncle. 3 shots rang out. Then the men ran away. So it leaves us in a little bit of a cliffhanger, a suspenseful moment, because what has happened? Did they shoot Uncle? We'll find out in chapter 11. Chapter 11, A Long Walk to Water. Chapter 11 for Naya's section is really short, so I'm just going to read it as we talk about it. So it begins with, after the 2 men left the village, the task of clearing more of the land between the trees began. It was very hard work. The smaller trees and bushes had to be burned or uprooted. The long grass had to be scythed and hoed under. It was dangerous work, too, as poisonous snakes and scorpions hid in the grass. Naya was still making the 2 daily trips to the pond. Each time she returned, she could see that slowly but surely the patch of cleared earth was growing larger. The earth was dry and rock hard. Naya felt puzzled and doubtful. How could there be water in such a place? And when she asked Depth that question, he shook his head. She could see the doubt in his eyes, too. So they really don't believe that these men know what they're talking about. But yet, somebody believes them, and I think whether they believe them or not, I think there's hope that these men are right. Because if they could get water right there at their village, it would make life so much better for them. They wouldn't have to send their children to the watering hole and get water each day, and that wouldn't consume the children's morning times. They could be doing other things with that time, and it would also be a way that they wouldn't have to leave their homes for the 2 months that they go to the campsite where at the water hole at the lake when their water holes dry up. So there's hope, but there's also a lot of doubt. In chapter 11, we find out that those 3 gunshots were in fact aimed at Uncle. And it starts by saying in Salva's section on the bottom of page 64, they buried Uncle in a hole about 2 feet deep, a hole that had already been made by some kind of animal. Out of respect for him, the group walked no more that day, but took time to mourn the man who had been their leader. Salva was too numb to think, and when thoughts did come to him, they seemed silly. He was annoyed that they would not be able to eat after all. While the men had been looting the group, while they were robbing them, more birds had arrived and pecked at the roasted stork until it was nothing but bones. The time for grief was short, and the walking began again after dark. Despite the numbness in his heart, Salva was amazed to find himself walking faster and more boldly than he had before. He feels a little bit of determination, and he gets that from the feeling that Uncle would want him to continue on and to finish his journey. And so, in a way of honoring Uncle, he gets up and he goes. He's got this renewed energy. He does think about his friend Mariel. Remember the one that was taken off by the lions? He thinks of him. And now he's lost Mariel and he's lost Uncle and he lost his family prior to that. So, it's very harsh. I'm sure Salva was aware of the newer tribe, their violence towards Salva's people. But to see it firsthand and for them to kill his uncle directly in front of him is something that really impacts him as well. And during a time of war in southern Sudan, and these newer men would have been removed from their homes as well because of the war, and that they still were being violent towards this other tribe that all they're doing is trying to make it to the refugee camp, shows that they were not a people that were compassionate towards mankind as a whole. So it's a really sad part of the book. Once again, in Salva's life, he faced some very sad times and hard times. It says in the middle of 65 that even though Mariel and Uncle were no longer by his side, and they never would be again, Salva knew that both of them would have wanted him to survive, to finish the trip and reach the Itang refugee camp safely. It was almost as if they had left their strength with him to help him on his journey. And then at the bottom it says, now that Salva was without Uncle's care and protection, the group's attitude has changed towards him. Once again, they grumbled that he was too young and small, that he might slow them down, or he might start crying like he did in the desert. And so they kind of hold that against him. He acted like a baby there. He's probably going to do it again. And then when it came time that they did have food or even water, Uncle would always share with him. But Uncle would share with the whole group. He would make sure everybody got a chance to eat. And now that Uncle's gone, these people don't repay the favor to Salva. They won't share their food with him, so he has to beg. And when he does beg, they only give him scraps that are left over, something we would give to an animal, a dog, like, okay, well, here's a bite. And so no one's there taking care of him anymore now that Uncle's gone, even though Uncle took care of these people. And it says on the top of page 66, the way they were treating him made Salva feel stronger still. So he takes this isolation that they're giving him, he takes this lack of compassion that they're giving to him, and it makes him stronger because he wants to prove to them that he can do it. He's not too small, he's not too weak, and he's not a baby. He can do it. So it says, there is no one left to help me. They think I am weak and useless. They are wrong, and I will prove it. Then the next section, we see that Salva has made it to the refugee camp. He has survived. He's made it to the refugee camp, and there are thousands of people there. So it says he's never before seen so many people in one place at the same time. How could there be this many people in the world? And it's just in this one area. And it says that there are people in lines and masses and clumps. They're milling around, they're standing, sitting, crouching on the ground. Some are lying down, but they can't lie down straight. They have to lie down with their legs curled up because there's not enough room for them to lay down straight. On the top of page 67, it says young men and sometimes even boys were often forced to join the fighting, which is why their families and communities, including Salva's schoolmaster, had sent the boys running into the bush at the first sign of sighting. So while he sees people of all ages, and he sees men and women, boys and girls, all types of people, there's a large number of men and boys, and especially young men. And it's because these men would have been taken and made to fight in this war, and they didn't want to. They didn't want to be a part of it. And their families didn't want them to either because it would probably mean certain death for them. And so there's so many boys and men and young men who ran and fled that they're all here at the refugee camp. So while you see all types of people, there is a large group of boys and young men. Children who arrived at the refugee camp without their families were grouped together, so Salva was separated at once from the people he had traveled with. And because they've been mean to him since his uncle died, their leader died, and they've not cared for him, you would think Salva would be happy to be away from them. But in spite of how bad they treated him, it's all he knew right now in life. It's all he had that was familiar. So when they separated him from this group of people who were mean to him, he felt scared and he felt alone. He would have rather have stayed with the people who were mean to him than to be alone without them. So as he walked through the camp with several other boys, Salva glanced at every face he passed. He was looking for his family. And so he remembers that Uncle had said that no one knew where his family was for certain. And because no one knew where his family was, it was possible that his family was here at the camp. And he had hope that possibly they were there. But he looks around and he felt his heart sink a little, but he clenched his hands into fists and made a promise. If they are here, I will find them. And then it takes us on to a further time. It says, after so many weeks of walking, Salva found it strange to be staying in one place. So here he's spent some time looking for his family. You have a time period that moves on a little bit, and he finds that it's very odd for him to not be walking somewhere. And so while he looks for his family, it's just he's got a place where he can stay, and he's not used to that anymore. So it says, but now that on page 68, it says, but now that he was at the camp, he felt restless, almost as if he should begin walking again. The camp was safe from the war. There were no men with guns or machetes, no planes with bombs overhead. And on the evening of his very first day, Salva was given a bowl of food, and he ate that. And then he got another bowl of food in the morning. So this is very different for him as well. Already things were better here than they had been during the journey. He's had 2 bowls of food within probably 12 hours. So this is good news. During the afternoon of the second day, Salva picked his way slowly through the crowds. Eventually, he found himself standing near the gate. And what he sees at the main entrance there is more people coming in. They just keep coming in. He already felt like no more people could be contained in this refugee camp, but more people are coming in. He's watching the new arrivals, and it did not seem as if the camp could possibly hold any more. Long lines of people, some emaciated, so they haven't eaten. They're really thin. You can see their bones. Some hurt or sick, but all were exhausted. And so I don't think Salvo looked much different from them, even though he's had 2 bowls of food since he's been there, too. He probably still looked emaciated as well because it takes a little time to put some weight back on when you haven't eaten for so long. At the bottom of page 68, it says that Salva scanned the faces. A flash of orange caught his eye. Orange, an orange handkerchief. He began pushing and stumbling past people. Someone spoke to him angrily, but he did not stop to excuse himself. He's pushed somebody and they turn and, hey, watch out, and he just keeps going. He could still see the vivid spot of orange. Yes, it was a headscarf. The woman's back was to him, but she was tall like his mother. He had to catch up. There were too many people in the way. So he sees someone with an orange headscarf. His mother wore an orange headscarf. She was tall, and this lady was tall. So he thinks possibly, here's my mother. And so he's chasing after her, trying to get to her through the crowd. And it says at the very end of page 69, a half sob broke free from Salva's lip. He mustn't lose track of her. He's got to catch her because his mother could possibly be there, and he needs to catch up to this woman to see if it's her or not.